Howard Liddell was an ecological designer and community architect. He was acknowledged as one of the leading architects in this basis in Europe over about a 40-year period. There were many kind tributes to him when he died of skin cancer in 2013. A magnesium taper burning with indignation at the self-destructive hubris of humankind is one of the indications why Ian McHarg might have been one of his heroes. Howard was outspoken. He was called a truth teller. And throughout his career, he encouraged many people to be more radical, more green, and to have much more heart. The memorial lectures are an opportunity to acknowledge his legacy, not just in his buildings, which are memorable, but also to complete some unfinished business. Many will know Howard as the author of the book Eco-Minimalism. It was much acclaimed. But for Howard, that was never intended to be the end of the story. When he died, he was working on EcoMax. Now, EcoMax was a little bit different. It was called the Carbon-Free Lectures because what he was trying to do was to give voice to many of the underrepresented aspects of ecological design and the environment, which seemed to get subsumed in discussion simply about carbon, not even carbon dioxide quite often. And Howard wished to do this by paying respects to pioneers in the field. So Howard didn't know that I was going to take on this project, and in many respects it's been a huge gift from him to me, and one that it's been fabulous to share so far with other people. In year one, I gave an overview of the pioneers, Howard's heroes, and that lecture is actually available, filmed, and it's online, and I can give you the contact for that. In the second year, in 2016, we looked at the life and legacy of Rachel Carson, who was a marine biologist and the author of Silent Spring, which many people of my generation see as a very transformative work in their education. It led to us putting on a play and a film, and it also led to an interest from a lot of people in how our professions are using toxic materials in the environment, and to multiple screenings of this film throughout a whole year. Last year, I covered the life and legacy of Barry Commoner. Now, Barry Commoner was a professor, a biologist, a politician, ecologist, and an author of The Closing Circle, which is one of the simplest, easiest, most accessible books to read on this stuff. That actually was quite timely because the film we chose to show was A Plastic Ocean, based on a theory of Barry Commoner's that everything must go somewhere. And it was quite timely in providing more energy for the debate against single-use plastics. And again, multiple screenings, multiple occasions to celebrate Commoner's life and to raise aspects of these issues. So this year, certainly Barry Commoner and Rachel Carson, along with me, Ian McHarg, were absolutely key to putting ecology into mainstream thinking. So Ian McHarg was a Scottish landscape architect and writer on regional planning using natural systems. He was born in Glasgow in Clydebank in 1920, and he went on to found the Department of Landscape at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. His 1969 book, Design with Nature, pioneered the concept of ecological planning. This evening's event will span the period from Ian's childhood to the present day. It will present some of Ian's thoughts and ideas, including some in his own words. I've taken excerpts from a documentary made by him in 1969. After which there'll be time for us to reflect and have some discussion, and then I aim briefly, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, to bring things up to date with a look at some contemporary practice in urban ecology. The presentation can't do anything more on touch on the enormous contribution that Ian McHarg has made to our environment, but what I would hope to do is simply to draw out from you in the best educational style a greater interest in finding out more about him. Design with Nature, Ian McHarg's most famous book, which is 50 years old next year, was the first work of its kind to define the problems of modern development and present a process for achieving compatible solutions. It laid the foundations for environmental impact assessment and regenerative design. No small achievements, I would say. Ian McHarg's defining characteristics were his colourful language and manner. He took few prisoners and made few friends from corporate America, but was highly influential. He called out bad developers and accused them of rape and pillage. He had an enviable talent for insult. He defined highway engineers as persons who, if struck with a blow with a 4-pound hammer on one ear, could not transmit a reverberation through to the other ear, audible with a stethoscope. Class. I think we've all felt that way about highway engineers. Any in the audience? No, got away with it, good. He called mankind in general blind, witless, lowbrow, anthropocentric clods who inflict lesions upon the earth. Frankly, difficult to argue with that too. He also refused very much to do a job twice the same way. Now, Howard must have particularly respected that, because every project had to advance the art, as Howard always sought to do also. So Ian McHarg wrote his autobiography in 1996, and it describes his obsession, which is the environment. And it delivers some very deep insights into his beliefs and his sense of awe. He considered the universe to be improbable and miraculous. We are made from the ashes of the stars. He was very aware of the Gaia hypothesis, which in the 1970s defined the Earth as a single interacting organism and considered it could be a basis for a new understanding of nature and ecology, theology, economics, work, and a new approach to adaptation, planning, and design. If only. He believed that our increased capacity to devastate the Earth and destroy would make us aware of our actions. And he believed that awareness of global warming would introduce a constructive debate about how we treat the environment. If only. But to the beginning. He opens his autobiography at age 11 in the depths of the Depression in Glasgow, at what he calls the fulcrum. Behind his house, open countryside, a beautiful, powerful landscape. Now, the West Highland Way. To the front, the smokestacks, Clyde Cranes and mills of Glasgow. Tenements with no street trees, parks or redemption. Grim, urban squalor, poverty and despair. This view of the city was to permeate his work. His family and early years. He states that his love of nature and gardening was acquired from his mother. But the church was the centre of his father's life, and he developed a deep interest in religion himself, learning great clumps of the Bible. However, it was the creation story in Genesis that at the age of 16, despite being a committed Christian, his attitude to Christianity came unstuck and set him on a path to ecology. He rejected totally this notion of subduing the earth and dominion over all life. He remained a Christian, but describes himself as having found spirituality by the sea and in the mountains. And seemingly, he maintained a lifetime respect and interest in other religions. Clearly, he was a very accomplished student who was talented in painting and a keen reader and writer. And it was a careers advisor who proposed landscape architecture, a subject of which he was self-confessed ignorant. After one trip to Perthshire with a prospective employer, he was apprenticed. Like many of his age, with Christian beliefs in pacifism, he nonetheless volunteered for military service, influenced by the barbarity of Mussolini and Hitler. Because he'd not completed college, he entered young and unqualified and was known as the art student. Great. He was singled out for the most unpleasant tasks, some of which, in his autobiography, make fabulous reading. He sought advancement by volunteering and excelling at every possible opportunity, and he achieved 8 promotions, leaving as Major McHarg. His contribution as a landscape architect up to this point was a military cemetery in Athens. On being demobbed, he made a decision to study landscape architecture at Harvard, to which end, being completely unqualified, he wrote to the architecture school, at that time headed by Walter Gropius, to tell them of the imminent arrival of Major McHarg. What a guy. To study on the postgraduate programme, no less. On arrival, they did not reject him, but did require him to pass a year of preliminary exams. He says the experience led him to be kind to those who lacked appropriate qualifications. Again, I'm reminded of Howard, who entered architecture school here in Edinburgh with 3 language A-levels, after a year as tea-boy in the offices of the architect who'd interviewed him. And he left with a first-class honours. At Harvard, Major McHarg simultaneously took a master's in landscape architecture, which is largely gardens for the rich, which he called cookie cutting. And another, sorry, I have more cookie cutting. Lots of cookie cutting. If you want to get really depressed, go to a French garden, I always say. And which he found really, and another in city planning. So that's 2 simultaneous master's degree. And he also undertook numerous undergraduate courses to become familiar with the American system. On graduation, he returned to Scotland to take up a post as assistant planner. Now, planning was located in the Department of Health, and he considered that as an inspired location. He put it down to the influence and legacy of Geddes as a sociologist and planner. He then had a period of severe ill health and spent a tortuous time in a hospital in Costofen before escaping to a Swiss sanatorium on a grant for retired parachutists. Everybody gets their day. And this simply reconfirmed his desire for a career in designing and placemaking for human health and well-being. However, he found professional life in Scotland far from satisfying. They all groaned together. He bemoaned the lack of cooperation over land between ministries, and he was involved with many of them, responsible for energy, for agriculture, for forestry, for fisheries, for food, mining, traffic, transportation, housing and commerce that might enable planning to happen. He also noted that the area not subject to planning was its greatest success, and that was preservation of agricultural land. He was very saddened by the exploitation of hydropower, which bypassed the opportunity for community good and agricultural development. He recognised the value of retaining the then excellent public transport system, the infrastructure of trams and trains and buses, clearly against the grain. He well understood the theory of induced capacity that many policymakers still struggle with today. New highways will become saturated with new traffic. But he was influential in preventing a highway along the eastern shore of Loch Lomond. And for anybody who's walked it, I think we can still be grateful. It was an interesting time with change in pursuit of improved public health and well-being. But he despised that housing was undertaken with dogma and stencil, no intelligence, little skill, and without landscape architecture participation. He became a critic of modernism, not on principle, but because as far as he was concerned, it missed the point. He argued that low-rise housing, of a multiple family housing, offered opportunities more responsive to place and people at densities akin to traditional village life and able to sustain services. Now, interestingly, that low density low-rise high density is much more the modern idea of urban ecology. And he contrasted the UK low-cost housing experience with models emerging in Scandinavia and Switzerland, with dining spaces facing private gardens, subtended by common space, and cars allocated to the backs of the houses, an inversion of our suburban model, of course. As there was no money allocated to landscape for housing, he undertook research into the cost of open space in housing, and he identified it as a very modest packet of cigarettes per family per week, which is a lovely, if somewhat outdated unit, I would say. We need more of those. He then went on to teach landscape architecture at the Edinburgh College of Art and in Glasgow for 3 years, and he was invited to write a memo on creating a degree programme, and the memo sat for 30 years. He was also invited to investigate Cumbernauld as a site for a new town, and his research and conversations there led him to conclude that it was a miserable place. Wetter than most, with intractable mud, poor, sour soil, a high water table, few trees, and those wind-pruned. And he drew a comparison. He drew a comparison with Greek colonists and city builders who found defensible locations adjacent to good agricultural land. And apparently, so Ian tells me, they grazed animals, and after a year, some of the animals were slaughtered and they were examined for deformities and anomalies, thereby investigating the availability of nutrients and the existence of toxins. A sophistication, I suspect, beyond the 1950s and now. In Scotland, the housing rules at that time were very simple. No steep slopes or prime agricultural land. Beyond that, you could do anything. But McHarg noted that slopes had not permitted growth in, well, let's think Rome, Siena, Frascati, San Francisco. So he was quite keen to investigate alternatives, and he developed a proposal for 4-storey terraced housing, equivalent to a 4-storey tenement, stepping down a steep slope, the flat roof of one house, a terrace, and a balcony for the house above. It provided economies of construction and energy saving from earth shelter, and there were 40 dwellings per acre. Its rejection on the grounds that it was so revolutionary that the English hadn't built anything like it yet was the last straw. He went home to consider the low-level discourse, lack of passion, and inactivity. He wrote to a friend in the United States inquiring about any professional opportunities. By return, he received an invitation to become assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania to develop a department of landscape architecture at a salary 10 times the one that he then enjoyed. It was 1954. He was a very happy man, but he'd also begun to realise on the back of slum clearance that emerging problems were metropolitan and not just urban. He described himself as ludicrously unprepared to become a founder and chair of a new department. And paradoxically, I suspect that was the reason for his success. I think the fact that he knew so little is what made him delve deeper. And in my experience, always employ people more intelligent than yourself. Always helps running a business, I always find. He decided to start a graduate programme rather than an undergraduate programme, and to attract qualified architects who wanted to do postgraduate study in landscape architecture. He started with 8 students from across the globe, and he staffed it with visiting professors of distinction. And the first 5 years of the course was spent in bringing together best practice, historic and contemporary, and in pursuing the solution of conspicuous social problems. So students working on real-world issues. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional teacher, and many of his students took forward his ecological planning approach. He then started to identify some concerns initially with the lack of any engagement on the part of the intellectual leaders in architecture and planning with the environment, but also with the lack of consultation with inhabitants. He began to seriously question his own education, and on reflection he realised in the sum total of 5 years there had been no mention of the environment. None. So that essentially set him on the course for his next 5 years. This is a good time to introduce McHarg's view of Darwinism. This has been something of an adventure for me, learning about Ian McHarg. I've always struggled with the idea that Darwin promoted survival of the fittest. I could never quite believe that's what he meant. I always assumed that he actually meant the most fitting. And when Mark McHarg addresses this issue, he started by defining a fit environment as one in which the greatest number of needs of the user are provided as found, where the least work of adaptation is required. For any species, and I've looked at this with birds and other animals myself, the least time you spend hunting and keeping warm, the more time and energy you have for leisure and procreation. So selection of the best environment, which he called ecological planning, was therefore the human equivalent of adaptation, which is frankly a big issue. He then went on to advocate that natural processes that perform valuable functions without assistance be recognised and maintained in the urban fabric. By that one can say passive energy, solar energy, light, daylight, natural environment, whatever. And that observing rules about land unsuitable for development in the interests of health, safety and welfare would then naturally allow a continuous and productive system of open space to permeate metropolitan areas. And he evolved a method by which important factors could be appraised as good, neutral or bad. Those locations with the most positive and the least negative ones would be the most fit environments. It requires less work of adaptation than any other. And this was just the start of the layer cake approach, which he went on to develop to huge impact, and I will discuss further in a minute. It was then in 1959 he initiated a course called Man and the Environment. I actually don't find that terribly offensive. I also did a university course called Man and the Environment, with the input of globally important guest speakers on the scientific concepts of matter, life and mankind, major philosophies and religions, and the interaction of man and nature. It was radical. At the start, in 1959, the environment was not even a topic. There were conservationists, but there were no environmentalists. So he actually educated himself alongside his students, and it became the most popular course on campus. It led to a CBS TV programme, and it was source of all the material in Design with Nature. At this time, he also revisited his original rejection of Genesis and invited numerous theologians to debate it, eventually concluding that no one had identified any survival value in subduing the earth, which led him to make a film, Multiply and Subdue the Earth. He had quite a sense of humour. Before we show excerpts from the documentary, I just want to show an early example of a more detailed layer cake approach, in this case, to route selection. McHarg was approached while lecturing in Princeton and asked to discover an ecologically sensitive alternative to the routing of the I-95 across the Delaware. He had precisely 6 weeks to study 600 square miles. He set out in search of a route that was least cost and maximum benefit. I can't demonstrate that study, but I can show you an example of the kind of study that followed. At the time, highway design simply looked at slope, property ownership and land value, and there was no community consultation. So McHarg undertook an inventory of climate, geology, hydrology, soils, vegetation and wildlife, and then interpreted this for implications for an interstate highway to identify the solution with the least cost. Each was interpreted in shades of grey, with the greater the cost, the darker the grey. So climate, fog, snowdrift, ice and inversions, their presence is a cost, their absence is a benefit. Bedrock and surficial geology for foundation costs and cost of excavation. So sand and gravel were a benefit because they were cheap and they were also a resource. Slope, in excess of 3%, they were a cost, and the greater the slope, the greater the cut and fill costs. Water values, the cost of streams and river crossings. Surface drainage, the cost of degrading water quality from road-related pollution, from road salts, effluent and heavy metals. Scenic quality, wildlife habitats, recreation value, land value, and historic value of buildings. But I love this bit. Because a cost to one person is not a cost to another person, each community was allowed to include or exclude a particular factor, and indeed could use a number of the same slide to provide additional weight. So, for example, the historic preservationists could heavily weight their areas of concern, because they always do. They could lay this over and over, and that was fine. And in Delaware, once you synthesised this, there was an obvious ecological and socially responsive alternative. So the original proposal, and it was also the cheapest. At a research cost, which was a fraction of the highways research budget. This was the genesis of environmental impact assessments. Ta-da! Digitising of all of this data into punch cards was the beginning of computerised ecological planning. This was only 64. And geographical information systems. And that is what we now know more as a physical representation of the layer cake. He went on to develop the method to embrace, well, most things. There was a big grant from the Ford Foundation, and he ended up with geologists and ecologists and computer scientists. He was particularly proud that this was in an applied professional programme and not a science department. There was never enough. There was never going to be enough. And through all of this, ecology was the underpinning and chronology. Time was always the link. The layer cake method was used in numerous ecological planning studies, often with his students acting as staff to task force, and hugely influenced national policy. That said, he never did concede to cities. His studies of the pathology of cities are astonishing. He looked at density, alcoholism, homicide, drugs, infant mortality, tuberculosis, salmonella. There's more. And mapped in the interest of finding out more about improving public health and well-being in cities. It would be interesting to know how he would look at cities today. In the meantime, what I intend to do is invite you to watch some excerpts from the film, listen to him in his own rather magical voice, and then perhaps we could have a discussion.
As the population increased in size, as there were more interactions between individuals, the change that took place was not so much in the character of the deviance of behavior, but in the fact that a larger and larger percentage of the total population exhibited deviance in behavior that was not of survival value to the group.
25% of the residents of Midtown Manhattan are severely impaired or incapacitated by mental illness. 58% exhibit varying degrees of pathology. Less than 1 in 5 is mentally well. These are the results of the most thorough analysis of mental health in New York City. The Midtown Manhattan Study was published in 1962 after 8 years of research by psychiatrists at the Cornell University Medical College.
And when there are 100 million more of us by the year 2000, will our cities be sicker still, our suburbs just as sick, our landscape further befouled? That's likely to be so, mate. And the reason is simple. We are a man-centered society. We have never learned that we are a part of nature. Show me any civilization that believes that reality exists only because man can perceive it, that the cosmos was erected to support man on its pinnacle, that man exclusively is divine, and then I will predict the nature of its cities and its landscape. The hot dog stands, the neon shill, the ticky-tacky houses, the sterile cord, the mined and ravaged countryside. This is the image of anthropocentric man. He seeks not unity with nature, but conquest. Yet unity he finds when his arrogance and ignorance are stilled and he lies dead under the greensward.
Among us, it is widely believed the world consists solely of a dialogue between men, or men and God, while nature is a faintly decorative backdrop to the human play called progress or profit. If nature receives attention, then it is only for the purpose of conquest or even better exploitation. For the latter not only accomplishes the first objective, but provides a financial reward for the conqueror. We have but one explicit model of the world, and that is built upon economics. The present face of the land of the free is its clearest testimony, even as the gross national product is the proof of its success. Money is our measure, convenience is its cohort, the short term is its span, and the devil may take the hindmost is the morality.
God said, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it." Whatever the origins of Western man's attitude to nature, this is explicitly defined in Genesis. Man is exclusively divine, given dominion and enjoined to subdue the earth. The attribution of divinity to man alone denied divinity to nature. Nature and nature gods were seen as a threat to the primacy of Jehovah. This insistence upon mastery and conquest encourages man's most destructive instincts. When this is understood, then the depredations and the despoliation are comprehensible.
This is a result of pollution at Lake Tahoe. Destructive building practices expose the soil on the hillside slopes to the rainfall in the spring, the melt in the spring, and that melt washes the nutrients from the soil that's been disturbed. The forest ordinarily being a very efficient recycler of these nutrient materials. It washes into the lake, and that's the result right there.
That is the forest, or that used to be the forest. And that used to be the soil up on the slopes of the hills around here before they were bulldozed away. The very substance of the forest soil has washed down into the lake. Now you see it in the form of algae.
The Indians of the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico have been drinking water from Taos Pueblo Creek for over 700 years. It is not polluted. To them, the creek and all the land surrounding it are sacred.
Our heart bleeds, make us sad when we see dead trees, dead flowers, dead grass. But when we see green stuff, green leaves, make us happy.
I was born with mountains just behind my home, not quite as beautiful as yours, but still they were very, very beautiful to me. And I think this sense of responding to the mountains and the sky, to the sea, and to trees, forests, birds, and so on was absolutely basic to all people. And it certainly was the view which was widely held, certainly 2,000 years ago in the West, that the people believed that the man and nature were one thing, there was no division, and that acts to nature were sacramental acts, as you believe today.
Yes.
But this tradition has been lost in the West. Judaism believed in one God in whose image was man made, and that man was in fact given dominion over all life and non-life, and he was in fact required to subdue the earth. which is very different from living in it and being of it. Christianity simply absorbed the same stories of Jews, and this attitude of man dominant was incorporated into the whole Western tradition. And by the Middle Ages, you could see this. It was actually visible in the cities, the churches, the gardens, and the landscape. There was a walled church, a walled garden, and a walled city. The inside of the city was the city of godly man, and then inside this was a walled garden. And nature was outside the city. Nature was thought to be bestial and carnal and a temptation to man. The great period of growth, of course, in European history was the Renaissance. And at that point, suddenly men were empowered really to make a profound effect upon the land.
And of all the symbols that you can see which reflect that attitude to the land, the garden probably is the clearest, because a garden doesn't really have any particularly important function. It simply is a device by which you can express your attitude to nature. Well, the very epitome of the Renaissance view is represented by Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte. Here you have nature laid down like an embroidery pattern. It's the idea of nature as wallpaper, the imposition of a simple Euclidean geometry upon nature. There are these axes, 1.5 miles long, half a mile wide. Nature reduced to a sea of gravel and sand and tractable plants, arranged with cookie shapers. Just so long as you say a beautiful thing and not a metaphysical symbol, you can't complain about it. If you say it's a lovely garden, fine. There's nothing wrong with arranging some plants. But if this is a view of nature, and you assume that you absolutely will make nature in this image, and you're confronted with an entirely new continent, you're a conquistador, you're a conqueror. You come then to the spoil.
And so this is what the colonists were. These were men who came believing nature to be hostile, nature is something to be conquered, as we believe space today is to be conquered, or the ocean is to be conquered. And so they came and they accomplished their works by destroying this hostile nature. They cut down forests not because they wanted the timber, they cut it down because they were frightened of the trees. They were frightened of the ghosts within the trees, the evil spirits within the trees. They cut this thing down, they destroyed it. They wanted to make a pastoral image, they wanted to tame nature in order to demonstrate their exclusive divinity and their God-given license to express this domination and subjugation. Now, within all of this, one of the most astonishing things happened. The English, and when I speak about the English, I'm very objective because the Scots and the English have had an ancient antagonism. In England at this time, the agriculture was probably as backward as in Europe. The whole country was denuded of forests, and this was simply a poor, backward country. And at that time, strangely enough, there came to be some Englishmen who believed it was possible to have a harmony between men and nature. In the 18th century in England, a very small handful of men, half a dozen of them, took this idea of a harmony of nature, re-enclosed the lands, reforested the lands, and made probably the most beautiful and productive landscape that's ever been made consciously by men in the whole Western tradition. Horace Walpole said that these men, these landscape architects, left the wall, the garden wall, left the wall and found all nature to be a garden. Well, the tragedy of the 18th century was that there wasn't even enough in England to stay the tide of industrialization. And this, of course, this enormous power, wedded to the instinct to dominate and subjugate nature, was simply transferred across the Atlantic. And with greater powers and this vast continent, man's inordinate capacity to uglify and destroy was given full license, and we have seen the result.
I think you'd probably select the Jersey Shore as a supreme example of development based upon ignorance, greed, and malice.
On the New Jersey shore alone, the Great Atlantic Storm of 1962 caused $80 million damage, destroyed 2,400 homes, and left 28 dead.
We carried $35,000 insurance on the building we lost. But because it was damaged by seawater, which they're not liable for, they settled for 1%, $350. I couldn't believe it for some time. But, I mean, many people suffer reverses, and you just can't lay down and quit. And we looked around, and we didn't want to go anywhere else. So we rebuilt here, and this is our home. It's like people along the rivers that flood and get washed out, or they go back. like the lemmings, I guess, that run over the cliff and commit suicide.
If people here had only understood that the sand dunes were the protection against the sea, this would never have happened. But they bulldozed the dunes, and what resulted was disaster. And when there's another big storm, it will happen again. And so, all this is the inevitable result of the vast powers of the Industrial Revolution, wedded to Western man's presumption of dominion over nature. You see, it's not a problem of uglification at all. In a very real sense, it's a problem of survival. But all this need not be. After all, it was the natural sciences which powered the great efflorescence of technology and all the despoliation it has brought. Let us simply use the same sciences to understand and respect nature, to learn the degree to which we can safely intervene with our environment. This is what the science of ecology is. It is a study of how all the elements of a natural world relate to each other, all the physical and biological world which includes man. So we can say, if we really want a life of maximum fulfillment, then let's scrap our old value system based on ignorance and economics and adopt a new relation with nature based on ecology. Let us ask nature herself what lands we can develop and what we must leave untouched. Now, on the Jersey Shore, the ecology is very simple. The hard part is finding the place where you can see the expression of it. We've got to go to a state park, which is one of the few places they haven't fouled up. You see, in order to survive here, you've got to understand about the sea, about sand, about wind, about vegetation, and about groundwater. Without this understanding, you simply cannot survive in this environment. Now, it's a marvelous one because it is really so finally so simple that there is a sea, and then there is this intertidal zone, there is the beach. Generally, there is a primary dune on which we stand. Beyond a succession of secondary dunes, and then beyond that the back dune, and still follow the bay. And every one of these are quite specific environments, and each of them have specific tolerances. The sea is marvelous. It can stand any amount of use, assuming no pollution. No bathers, no number of bathers diminish the value of the sea. The same is true of the beach. The beach is remarkably tolerant. It can take the most intensive use without any destruction at all. But the minute one gets to the dunes and the vegetation, suddenly you find a zone of absolute intolerance. You see, the roots of the grasses intertwine to form a dense mat which stabilizes the dune against the wind and the sea, and the leaves entrap the grains of sand, and that's how the dune grows. If the grasses are removed or trampled, the sea and the wind will simply erode away the primary dune, and the environments which it protects will be vulnerable. So the dune is intolerant to walking, much less development. Now beyond the dune is a trough, and here limited development might occur. The trough is protected from salinity, wind, and driving sand. Plants can exist here, so the environment is more stable and more tolerant. But if you remove the plants or kill them, it is no longer stable. And the best way to kill them is to remove the groundwater. So that means no shallow wells, only deep wells. And beyond the trough are secondary dunes, which are the secondary defense against the sea, so we leave them alone. But then we come to the back dune, and this is tolerant like the trough, only more so. There is more protection, abundant fresh water, therefore more diverse vegetation, therefore increased stability, and it's furthest removed from storm and floods. So this is where most of the people should live. And beyond the back dune is a bay where we find shellfish and the breeding grounds of fish and wildfowl, and where we shall not dump our garbage. And so here, from this very, very simple ecological understanding, we can see the way in which man can live by the sea and enjoy the special fruits of the edge of the ocean. Now, the tragedy of all this is that it is kindergarten stuff in Holland where life depends upon the sea, but in this country, this knowledge doesn't reside in the intelligentsia, far less a political process.
Well, the Green Spring Valley is only 9 or 10 miles from the City Hall of Baltimore City, and yet we can live out here in the open country where we can just enjoy our own little 2 acres.
And when I come home at night, I always drive down the entire length of the valley, although it means extra time and extra distance. The pressures of the world just seem to vanish. Well, the valleys are obviously threatened by the fact that if you look at a map, you'll see that the valley's areas of 70 square miles are sort of in the middle of a V. And there's a radial that goes out this way from Baltimore and a radial that goes out that way. And there's industry here and industry there. And of course, you've got people driving back and forth to get to where they work. Well, ultimately, these pressures are going to go right through the bottom of that V and come right smack out into the middle of the valleys. And I'm afraid that when that happens, if there's no plan, an orderly plan of growth, we're going to lose what we have. And it would be really a tremendous tragedy, because we can accommodate this growth that we have and still retain a tremendous portion of the natural beauty.
A population of, I think, 15,000 could reasonably be expected to go to about 80,000 by 1980 and to 110 or 120,000 by the year 2000. And so we have some idea of the dimensions of the problem. The zoning controls which exist at the moment in the 70 square miles, 1 house per acre generally would have been built throughout, and it would have simply inexorably spread its way over the plateau, into the valleys, up the wooded slopes, expunging all of this testimony to 2 centuries of good husbandry, to wise land management, expunged it all and simply replaced it with a ticky-tacky of hot dog stands and gas stations and diners and billboards and sagging wire and split levels and ranchers, a testimony to greed, stupidity, and an inordinate capacity to destroy, and the total atrophy of any creative skills.
And this, of course, was their inevitable destiny. Why should they be spared? The rest of Baltimore County has succumbed, just as the rest of the country has, to the horrors of typical suburban development, the same dreadful cycle which begins when farmers find it more profitable to sell land and crops.
And about 5 years ago, every subdivider in Baltimore County was eyeing them enviously. It was as if there was a Homestead Act about to be signed, and the whole bloody lot of them were just waiting for somebody to sound a pistol, and they would come into this area and smear it.
Already, because of developments like this one, we have lost a great deal of natural beauty in and around our urban areas in California.
And they would expunge inexorably every piece of beauty you can see before you. And of course, inevitably, they go to the valleys first, because valleys are remarkably easy to develop. With the least of all possible investments, you can accomplish the greatest vulgarization and the greatest spoliation. You can accomplish the least profits for the least number of people with a maximum social loss.
Already, because of developments like this one, and of course many others, worse than this one, California has squandered 1/5 of its prime agricultural land since World War II.
Well, it seems to me that you're just suggesting that we substitute one resource for another. The resource, as a matter of fact, is not really agriculture after all. It's land, and we're talking simply about the use to which land should be put. You're suggesting agriculture, I'm suggesting residential development, and we get into a subjective discussion of whether your use is better or mine is better.
No, it is not subjective, my friend. Prime agricultural lands are objectively definable, and they are rare. It can take thousands of years for nature to create 1 inch of topsoil, and some continents don't even have any. In a world where millions are starving today and millions more will starve tomorrow, it is the most profound stupidity to sterilize these irreplaceable resources.
Let me ask the obvious question then, if not here, where?
The question was, there's got to be 110,000 people accommodated in this area of 70 square miles. How do you best develop it? We studied bedrock geology and groundwater resources and physiography, the various streams, the floodplains, and we came to some general conclusions about the degree to which the land, in fact, could absorb growth, welcome growth, and those areas where, in fact, development involved penalties both to the land developer and to society at large. We found that the valleys were coterminous with the most important groundwater resource in the whole Baltimore region. So we could say as a proposition, unless you want to make dysentery, diarrhea, hepatitis, and cholera a way of life, unless you would like to make your metaphysical symbol toilet paper, then don't develop in the valleys, because clearly this is an inordinate hazard to health. This is a major resource of groundwater for the entire community. And by such development with septic tanks, you will simply pollute all of the wells, and everybody here, of course, uses wells. But of course, there are other ways of developing valleys. You can introduce sewers, but sewers, of course, also lose water, and one can say that modern sewers are only a more advanced technological method by which you can pollute groundwater resources. So we then came to the conclusion that the valleys were, in fact, not propitious for development. So we said, what is the capacity of the wooded slope to absorb development? And we concluded that these forests of this age, this mixed deciduous forest, actually probably could absorb about 1 house per 3 acres. and still look like a forest. It wouldn't look like a broken-tooth forest. Where then can 110,000 people go? We found that between the valleys there were plateaus, and at the plateaus were anomalies. We found that there were, of course, no groundwater resources of any importance at all, that floodplains were absent, that there were no soils which were unsuitable for development with septic tanks, and moreover, this area was far and away the easiest of all to serve with sewers. And so we came to the general conclusion that the bulk of development should occur on the plateau. So instead of the idea of having simply diffused suburbanization occurring throughout, we suggested there be areas which were inordinately propitious for communities of different sizes. The valleys would remain in open space in perpetuity, the wooded slopes with very, very low density development, and the bulk of the population located in, I think, 30-odd communities existing in clusters within the forest and the plateau.
It is fissured with lakes. It is transected by three great rivers, the Mississippi, the Minnesota, and the St. Croix. There isn't any doubt about the value of these. There isn't any doubt about their beauty either. Is it inevitable that they have to attract all the crummiest, dreariest, most disgusting and ugly industries and uses? Do they have to be the inevitable repositories of dumps, garbage, rubbish, you know, the most scabrous industries? Do we have to turn our backsides to rivers? You see, the Seine is a commercial river, and the Seine goes through Paris, and the Seine remains a commercial river through Paris, and the Seine is beautiful through Paris. Almost every land use can exist adjacent to a river in a noble way. But you have to then insist in the first case that the river is noble and the land use be deferential to the river. There isn't any reason why industry and commerce cannot, in fact, impinge upon the river, but do this with some deference.
This pumps 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and when we're through with it, we'll have a beautiful industrial area of 1,100 acres of land all out of the river from a pipe. This is the type of work we're trying to do to create new dollars, new wealth, new information for St. Paul, to make it a new productive city, to take care of the growth that we see for the 1970s and 1980s. We will expect this land area to be filled up in the 1970s, and where we go from there, we may have to take it out of the river again.
I'm sure that one can find sites which are better suited for industry. We determined that lakes in general, and this one in particular, were not suitable for industry. Here obviously is a resource being spoiled. Can we start again and ask, where is there a place intrinsically suited for industry, so that we can have the best of both worlds? Lakes for all the delights that lakes can give, and areas best suited for industry.
Like most metropolitan areas, Minneapolis and St. Paul have developed with more respect for economics than for nature. But unlike most areas, they have begun to question how they can absorb their future millions without destroying the quality of their environment. In a rare move in urban America, the Twin Cities and 7 counties have formed a metropolitan council to deal with problems which concern the entire region. The council commissioned the first ecological study to be undertaken for a metropolitan area.
I have spent years of my life offering my palpitating hearts to various people who couldn't care less. And by and large, you know, the natural instinct is to stamp upon palpitating hearts. So palpitating heartism doesn't get you anywhere at all. It seems to me that one really needs to have two things. You want not only be able to say don't, but you also want to be able to say do. To be able to stand up to any developer and say, friend, I know about the last time. Man, you really made a shambles. The house is slid down the hill. You've got a number of them here, and somebody sued you. You know, you don't want that to happen again. And the man says, I certainly don't. You say, well, you just come to me. I'll tell you where. You know, we've got this map. It'll tell you the areas where you can get the best of all possible foundations, where you can guarantee to have dry basements, where indeed the recreational resources are inordinately attractive to prospective development. You see. And so you then are engaged in a positive inducement process in which developers are trooping in here, asking to find out places where development is most fitting for every function, be it an atomic power station or an airport or new town. Doesn't matter what it is. But the only thing you can ask is nature. You live in that area where the ice sheets came and went, and they have left their mark. And so we've got to know about superficial geology, because they've modified historical geology. If you know about climate, historical geology, and physiography, and superficial geology, you know about physiography, because that just happens to be the current state of the world's surface as a result of these ongoing processes. If you know about climate,
geology, bedrock geology, superficial geology, and physiography, then you know about hydrology. And if you know about the movements of water, then you know about soils. If you know about soils, then you can understand the distribution of plants. And if you know where plants are, then you know why animals are. Because, you know, squirrels eat acorns and robins eat worms. And when we get to that point, we can introduce man. But man responds to these things in a causal way, too. That is, he searched here for river corridors and for the confluence of rivers and for agricultural hinterlands, which were made of inordinately productive soils, which are comprehensible in terms of physiography and hydrology and fluvial processes. And is responsive to coal and to limestone and to iron and uranium and so on. All of which can be understood in terms of the litany of the progression which I have identified. But it's not enough simply to identify it this way. We have to integrate it, and that the integrating science, of course, is ecology, which is a study of the interaction of organisms and an environment, which environment includes other organisms. So that's what we did.
All this natural process data enabled us to determine the suitability of the land for various prospective uses. For urbanization, we selected favorable conditions of slope and aspect and orientation and foundation conditions and soil drainage and amenity. And we avoided detrimental conditions like floodplains and aquifer recharge areas. And so in various shades of red, we mapped urban suitability in a range of values. For agriculture, we selected conditions of soil, intrinsic productivity, physical properties, soil drainage, slopes, and so on, which represented primary agriculture and a range of values for agriculture in 5 grades. And we mapped this yellow. And we did the same thing for recreation by types, mapped in blue, and for protection, mapped in green. Here we identified all the lands where development would be a hazard to life or limb and the unique natural resources. Now, having identified these individual suitabilities, we had to arrange them in a hierarchy of importance. And we said, the category of protection preempts all other land uses.
Now, this was judgment. Of course, society doesn't do this at the moment. As I've suggested, the obverse is true. They say, give us a floodplain. We love to build in a floodplain. How else can we get our names in the paper? And so there they get their names in the paper, and they happily accept the proposition of digging the mud out of the basement.
So we set aside all these areas which should be protected. We then considered the highest categories of urbanization, of agriculture, and of recreation. And when we superimposed these maps, there were areas which were eminently suited for these particular uses. There was no conflict. We suggested these areas should be reserved for these uses. But there were other areas which were suited for several uses. And the people in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region have to resolve how they can have a creative mix of what land uses they prefer. And after we considered all the primary lands, we simply applied the same procedure to the lands of secondary and lower suitabilities.
And so tediously and slowly, we mapped this fantasy. And remember that we didn't know the answer as we proceeded. But finally, we assembled all of this information, and there it was down. All right, so I know it's terribly tedious stuff, but, you know, you bought this, and here it is, and, you know, you have to understand it.
Well, I was going to suggest that we do accept your report with gratitude and enthusiasm, Ian, and direct our staff to make further review of this material for us, and then to proceed to make recommendations to this council with regard to the several programs that we have that tie to this.
Mr. Chairman, my only requirement is that you accept this wholeheartedly and give your life over to its realization. That's all.
The realization of these ideas is not going to be easy. Most people fail to understand that land which deserves protection is best protected by leaving it in its natural state. They tend to think that any open space ought to be developed into parks.
When you provide parks, you aren't just acquiring property, you're developing. Well, certainly you're going to have some type of a highway system to these areas. In using equipment to develop the parks, you're building roads, you're cutting down bluffs.
Dear God.
You see, one day, it's going to be possible to store all the information in computers and ask the computer to find any city we dream of. To be able to ask it to find areas of inordinate beauty and intrinsic suitability for all the land uses that should compose a city, all the recreational delights and water and foundations and every other conceivable thing. And out of this glorious computer will print this marvelous map which will reveal just exactly that which we want to know.
But this is still just a dream, Ian. How do we get from here to there?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to resolve to let people live where they want most to live, to offer an environment of choice. We can have a sample survey and ask people what are their dreams in terms of physical environment, and take an ecological inventory of the entire country to find out what the land offers in terms of environmental choices, and then match the choices of the people to the promises and opportunities of the land. And from this mesh, produce a new urban America, a new environment of choice.
But people have to live in the big cities. That's where their jobs are.
Well, the glorious thing about this is they don't. You see, all the cities we live in are products of the conception of bondage to toil. Industry chooses a site in the first place. Housing takes the next option, and recreation has to take the residue. Now we can invert the whole situation. Whereas once industries had to be based near iron or coal or transportation, this is no longer true. We are now absolutely liberated from economic determinism.
Well, what we're really talking about then is planning on a massive scale.
Absolutely unimaginable scale. As different from the present as night and day. We must think of analogies more like the Marshall Plan, or the whole passion which engaged nations in World War II. And the best analogy, of course, is the passion that engaged this nation in the American Revolution. The revolution is incomplete. The physical environment that is a product of this great American dream is its worst indictment. It is not only necessary to achieve equity and justice, the emancipation of all men, but to make this vision clear in our cities and towns.
It was 50 years ago, and McHarg would not recognise the Goebbels of today after its recent and next cycles of regeneration. And quite honestly, I'd love to hear his views on the Goebbels of today. But Ian McHarg, being Ian McHarg, would have moved on, I think, and so have we. The current reality is that humans are now an urban species. Over half the global population lives in cities, and cities occupy only 2% of the land, but use 75% of the world's resources and generate 85% of its waste. It looks as if without McHarg's equivalent of the Marshall Plan, there will be no sustainable world without sustainable cities. One millennium goal. Cities have to be part of the solution. And it also looks as if McHarg's faith in the awareness of our ability to do no harm on an unprecedented scale, his belief that the risks posed by global warming and his hope for what we would do with the Gaia hypothesis have all also fallen on deaf ears. We are facing a number of crises, you may have noticed. Our ecological footprint is unsustainable. We're currently using an average of 3.2 planets, Edinburgh, and that's the global average as well. So what went wrong? Well, I'm going to go briefly back to last year's eco-hero, Barry Commoner, who said, everything must go somewhere. And I think we've forgotten that everything must go somewhere. And we've evolved this kind of take waste and pollute culture. And the consequences are climate change, they are species loss, they are toxicity, and they are pollution. To add to that, I think we've also forgotten responsible government and citizenship. Millennium goal, I think. The problem is that our relationship with cities is symbiotic. We do not simply shape the environment by what we do. The environment also shapes us. We don't just have poverty anymore in the way that perhaps Ian McHarg understood it. We also have to recognise that we have huge and increasing inequality. It's never been greater, and it will get greater. So I think if we were going to be looking at the pathology of cities, then we'd have to be overlapping that with homelessness, and we have to be overlapping it with urban heat islands, because homelessness kills. That's the symbiotic relationship that we're having. And urban heat islands kill, and drought kills, and floods kill, and pollution kills. And Edinburgh's not immune from that either. So all of those things are new overlays that we can put onto those maps. In fact, the EU estimates 500,000 early deaths in Europe, urban deaths due to diesel fumes. So no small issue. So what does urban ecology these days have to offer? Well, urban ecology actually seeks to develop long-term sustainable solutions to the problems that our living patterns generate. It's an attempt to develop strategies for living that fulfill our social and community needs and aspirations, but not threaten other species, and to respect the Earth's carrying capacity. Cities also have to be the centres for creativity and innovation. And McHarg said it, we're using a fraction of our creativity. And what a shame is that? And there are some lovely examples. There's some lovely examples. Social innovation. This was a suburban street food on land in the suburb of Melbourne, where they're creating new food growing opportunities. Copenhagen is an example where dealing with a new response to increased and quite devastating flooding, they're responding to incredibly creatively and playfully. There's economic innovation in cities. This is projects in Switzerland where they're actually adding 2 stories to blocks and using that extra value to make them into passive buildings. I have a top floor flat if anybody's interested. It's just a thought. There's technical innovations of bioluminescence, there's technical innovations of using new materials, mushroom buildings, building out of mycelium. There's lots of stuff. There's no end to this if we actually put our minds to our built environment properly. But of course, placemaking has to begin with bringing nature in. And there are lovely examples of natural environments fulfilling many of those criteria that Ian McHarg was talking about. In fact, in Berlin and in Malmö, there's a thing called the Biotope Area Compensation Measure. And it's much easier to say in German, I think. And every new development has to incorporate a percentage of the built environment as blue or green scape. So development like this, which is community development, is intended to preserve this space even in a dense urban environment. The proportion is about 30%. It's quite flexible, so you can do it by having turf roofs, you can do it by having ponds or pools, lots of options, but do it you must. It's a legal requirement. It has to be done. And you have to go back and check that it's working as well. You can't just put in a few lollipop trees and then disappear over the horizon. Not allowed. Can't do that. But it gives opportunities for communities to develop their own planting schemes. It's all playful. It improves the environment. Lots of rich balconies as well. and it improves generally the city and makes for that pathway that McHarg was talking about of health and well-being and allowing that to run through a city. In Germany, there are some quite nice examples where the local authority has actually bucked the trend of selling off land to a developer and instead putting the development team together themselves. Bit radical, that. And then they use a design quality framework to say what they actually want. And through that, they're developing affordable, healthy, energy efficient housing. And because they don't have to satisfy the developer's needs for 50% profit margins, they can invest the money, actually, in integrated transport infrastructure, in green open spaces, in blue and greenscape, in active ground floors, shops, offices, workshops, community hubs, making real places. What we call a city of small distances, where there's actually lots of stuff available locally, a community available locally, and that transport infrastructure has been paid for, so you can get to elsewhere if that's what you want to do. But essentially, it's all there within short distances. So it's affordable, it's vibrant, it's socially productive, it's architecturally diverse, and it's mixed use. In Vauban, they've been even more ambitious. It came later. They actually have energy exporting houses. Again, it's rich, it's diverse, population density is high, the car ownership is very low. Gosh, we don't have to buy 2 cars as well as the house. That's amazing. Adds to the affordability no end. And that transport infrastructure. I just want to say a little thing about densification, because in all of the work I've been doing on this, it's really banded around and confusing. And the simple thing I want to say is that this is a Joachim Abler project in Tübingen in Germany, and it's low-rise, high-density development. And it's quite compact, it's got all the passive solar and biodiverse rich and all that stuff. It's the same density as that block of flats behind, because it's built on the perimeter of the space. You could build the whole of Manhattan on 6 stories if you built on the perimeter. That's just the way it is. And so there's lots of opportunity for adding that green space. And the cars, again, pushed to the background, except for short-term needs, what people need them for, but for fundamental needs, but not to be able to park at your front door or indeed in your front living room, as many people seem to want to do. A brief note of a project also in Oslo. This whole idea of the city of small distances is actually starting to take root. This is a Future Built. It's a 10-year collaboration to prepare for net zero energy buildings, and it's supporting 50 climate neutral private and public sector projects. And there's lots of criteria about design for dismantling and being near. Any development has to be near to transport. It's got to have universal design. It's got to be safe. It's got to be comfortable. So they've got student accommodation, which is passive, needs no heating whatsoever. And they have this little city within the city, which is a redevelopment of an area, a big industrialised area on the banks of the river in Oslo. And it's got hotels, it's got schools, it's got training centres, it's got food markets, it's got shops, it's got housing, and it works. We could do with more of it. Again, many things are accessible, and then it's very easy to get beyond. And then on that citizenship and affordability and things, I just want to mention this project which is called Kalkbreite, and it's in Zurich. And it was the result of a design competition for a 250-unit development to sit over the overnight tram wash and parking station in central Zurich. And they invited 6 cooperatives to bid for it. Yeah, there are over 100 cooperative housing groups in Zurich. And it's part of the urban fabric. The people from the city can come into this area during the day, anytime. It's open to the public. It's properly fun, it's playful, it's really enjoyable. And as well as housing which demonstrates lots of ways to be a family. So there are clusters of single-person units around common areas. There are two-storey cooperative bits within the cooperative. It's also got a hotel, it's got a library, it's got a cafeteria, it's got meeting rooms. While I was there were lessons on English, there was Pilates, there was yoga, there was dance, there was lots of stuff going on. It's very lively, and it's no car use whatsoever. None. And none is needed. If you want a car for the weekend, you hire a car for the weekend. But for your regular activities, all of that is taken up by public transport, and this idea that things are accessible. I pondered quite a bit why the Swiss would be so forward-thinking on affordable housing, and I concluded that the Swiss are all very pragmatic, and they didn't want to be a generation of old people getting older with their children waiting for them to die, which is what we will become if we don't sort out this mess. They knew they had an affordable housing problem about 40 years ago, and they've solved it, because that's what you do when you've got a problem. You solve it. It's great. It's a lovely development, this. Lots of fun. There are examples like this. There are very few. There's a lovely one in Stroud. There's a very lovely one called Lilac in Leeds. And they're high performing and they're not for profit. And there's lots of scope for doing more things like this, I think. I think it's a design issue. Ecologically conscious design facilitates ecologically conscious behaviours. Those in turn do improve health and well-being, and they improve life chances. I think it's a very positive agenda, and it's about time we moved beyond style to substance, she said to all the architects in the room. I think it's about time we brought Ian McHarg's legacy home to Scotland, personally. And I think that buildings and the built environment should be at the heart and soul of social and economic policy. Full stop. Thank you very much.